Hello and happy World Accreditation Day, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you here for the first webinar within a special series of webinars on the role of international standards in countering the impact of COVID-19, jointly organized by the United Nations Industrial Development Organization and the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. My name is Dorina Nati, and I'm very pleased to be here today with the speakers. Today, on this very special day, we will start with a discussion on the role of international standards and accreditation in improving food safety. So the session will start with some introductory remarks by Mr. Bernardo Calzadilla-Sarmiento. Thereafter, Sean McCurtain will set the scene for us, and Ms. Kylie Sheehan will deliver a presentation on the topic. The attendees are encouraged to put their questions in writing, so please type your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. We expect to get a lot of questions. We're sorry if we will not be able to address all of them. We will do our best to select the most relevant questions and pose them to the speakers. Taking full advantage of the technology today, we will record the session and we will make the recordings available thereafter to the audience. One more thing I would like to mention for the attendees is when you leave the webinar, you will have the opportunity to provide some feedback to us. So please take 3 minutes of your time to provide your feedback on the session. We're always happy if we can improve. So having said that, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Bernardo Calzadilla-Sarmiento, Managing Director of the Directorate of Digitalization, Technology and Agribusiness at UNIDO. Bernardo, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Join you in this day of celebration. And when we celebrate accreditation, we celebrate standards, we celebrate conformity assessment, we celebrate all that what quality brings us about. But for us, it's also a moment of celebration of our cooperation with ISO. So thank you very much to our partnership. This is a very long-lasting partnership that we have and went through different process. We have been doing trainings, we have been doing conference together. UNIDO is known to be a international organization devoted to the development of quality infrastructure. And we started with the establishment of standardization body, metrology bodies. And in the recent years, since I would say the 2000, we started to work so closely on accreditation and all this to build trust, because when we link then accreditation with food safety, we see two elements are important: trust and management of risk. I would not like to take much time. Just once again, thank ISO for the excellent collaboration. We are launching, as it is today, Accreditation Day 2 publications. A publication on ISO IEC 17025 on the new version. This is a revamp of a guidance that we had for SMEs. We have named this document Tested and Accepted. And this document is being launched today. We hope it will be very useful for smaller countries which have not direct access. It's a primer into the standard. As well, we are mentioning a second publication. It's a small brochure that takes account how this process, conformity assessment, can be prepared to move into. This is the publication on conformity assessment in the digital age, and how we can help to take the most of the new technologies so that the conformity assessment bodies, quality infrastructure bodies are better prepared for the future. I think this is the challenge for us, sustainability, and take full advantage of the new technology so that everybody is prepared for this new digital age. Did not mention, COVID-19 has shown us that digitalization is fundamental and will get a lot of traction in the new phase. Thank you very much. Back to you, Dorina.
Thank you very much, Bernardo, for this announcement. And before I hand over to Sean McCurtain, we have some questions for the audience. So we would like to kick off the discussion today with a question which I'm showing to you right now. So as we're talking about food safety and accreditation of food safety management systems today, what do you think? Can one get COVID-19 from food? Yes or no? I'll give you about 10 to 15 seconds to answer to the question. So please be quick. What's your first reaction? I see the answers coming in. So 5 more seconds. All right, let's end the poll. So your guess is no, and you're right. Currently, in accordance with the WHO information we have received, there is no evidence that the coronavirus can be transmitted through food. Nevertheless, this doesn't make the topic of food safety less important in days of a global pandemic. So here are your results. And I have one more question for you. Question number 2. So what do you think? What measures can food businesses put in place to avoid contamination of their food products? No, not only one answer is correct. Please vote now. I'll give you again 15 to 20 seconds, not more. Be quick. What's your intuition? I see a lot of answers coming in. Five more seconds. And again, your intuition is very to the point. So implementation of food safety management systems got the most replies. Indeed, I believe all of the mentioned measures are important to control the safety of the food. But today we will definitely talk about food management systems, ISO 22000, and related accreditation. So thank you very much for participating in our polls. And with that, I don't want to take more of my time, so I hand over to Mr. Sean McCurtain, who is the Director of Conformity Assessment and Consumer Matters at ISO. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dorina, and good morning, good afternoon, and even good night to all of you who are online and joining us. I would also like to thank UNIDO for a joint hosting of this event. So thank you very much, UNIDO, for the opportunity. I'm going to try and set the background scene in terms of what Kylie is going to take forward in our presentation. Today, as we celebrate World Accreditation Day, who would have thought that the theme for World Accreditation Day, decided so many months ago, last year in fact, would become so relevant in relation to the current global situation. COVID-19 has not only changed the world, but it's also changed the way that we all behave. We have to re-examine how we do things, and we're also looking for alternative ways of achieving the same results. Food safety, security, and the supply chain are no exception. We, as a community of standards developers, conformity assessment bodies, accreditation bodies, and scheme owners, we have to adapt to ensure that we continue to provide the consumer and regulators with the necessary confidence that food is safe, secure, and available. Today, food supply chains are both complex and global, involving a variety of stakeholders. A typical food chain or value chain involves crop and animal production, distribution and transport, often very long distances and repeated at multiple stages along that whole chain, processing, packaging, storage, until the food eventually reaches the consumer through various outlets, either by retailer or catering. Added to this, we have to deal with the technical infrastructure that is given by different regulators at the international level, Codex Alimentarius, FAO, and at the national level. And very often in regions, the regulations are slightly different or applied differently. We further see the complexity of the food supply chain because it requires the full range of conformity assessment activities to be implemented. It involves testing, certification, and that certification can be management system or indeed product or a combination of management system and product. It involves inspection, verification, and of course accreditation, which is crucial in terms of providing that assurance that at the end of the day, food is safe. So we can say that the global supply chains require global standards. ISO and IEC have developed a series of conformity assessment standards called the CASCO Toolbox that ensures that bodies performing conformity assessment activities are competent, but also operate in a consistent and impartial manner. Additionally, TC 34 develops global standards on human and animal foodstuffs, also covering the food chain from primary production to consumption. A very good example is what was mentioned earlier, ISO 22000, which is a global food safety management system. The pandemic has disrupted to varying degrees all of the stages of the food supply chain. And because of this, it has also disrupted the way we perform conformity assessment activities. The conformity assessment community needed to respond quickly to ensure that we became part of the solution and not part of the problem. We needed to mitigate the impacts and at the same time ensure that we continue to provide that necessary confidence in the results producing safe food. How did our community respond? Was it quick enough? What did we learn? And I think that will be addressed a little bit later. Two of the main consequences of the pandemic were lockdown and social distancing. This had a significant impact on the food sector. Food supply, safety, and security are strategic issues for any country. The people of any country want to be assured by their governments that they will have an uninterrupted, safe food supply. So how did these consequences reset some of the basics against which we now perform conformity? Initially, some countries had tendencies towards protectionism and securing national food chains. The temptation for countries to sometimes respond independently to what was a regional or a global crisis had to be avoided. The food demand patterns began to change. We had the closure of restaurants, putting increased pressure on supermarkets to meet the additional demands. It was only when consumers really believed that supply levels were secure did panic buying reduce. Smaller workforces due to social distancing have impacted the supply of food. The agricultural, fruit, and meat processing industries were especially impacted, sometimes up to 50% in terms of what they could supply. Limitations on the movement of food and workers, especially across borders, added potential problems. Were the regulators and the conformity assessment community open to accommodating new approaches and able to prioritize food safety activities based on risk? It's a question for Kylie to answer in her presentation. Recently, CASCO published a statement on COVID and the CASCO Toolbox, and it emphasized some very important points. Conformity assessment bodies, including accreditation bodies, operate using competent people. This means they can react appropriately in different situations. Conformity assessment bodies and accreditation bodies have established management systems, and this allows them to operate in various types of environments, including pandemics. The risk-based approach is an important element to focus on the health and safety of those involved in the delivery of the conformity assessment. But risk-based approach is also important in maintaining impartiality and ensuring reliable results. And then, of course, the standards need to be flexible enough to allow us to use alternative approaches, such as remote auditing and assessment. How did this reality shape the response of the conformity assessment community? We were well prepared for unusual events that were very localized, but we weren't so well prepared for events that were global and simultaneous. So we need to learn those lessons with respect to it. Additionally, on top of that, we know that the community, the conformity assessment community faced these challenges. And I'm sure that Kylie will address those in response and also indicate what have we learned from these experiences. Thank you, and back to Dorina.
Thank you very much, Sean, for setting the scene for us. And without further ado, I would like to hand the floor to Kylie Sheehan. Kylie is a General Manager of Operations for the Joint Accreditation System of Australia and New Zealand. She's a conformity assessment expert with extensive experience in each part of the accredited certification chain. She is currently a co-convener of the International Accreditation Forum Working Group on Food and Working Group for Certification of Persons. And she's also a convener of the ISO CASCO TC, responsible for the revision of food safety management system conformity assessment body requirements, ISO 22003. We're very pleased that Kylie Sheehan is here with us today. And Ms. Sheehan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Dorina, and happy World Accreditation Day, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. I'm coming to the end of mine, but hopefully everyone's having a great World Accreditation Day. The title of my presentation this evening is the role of international standards and accreditation in improving food safety. So in the time that I have been involved in standard setting and also in accreditation, there's been a great deal of change with respect to the standards that we use both for accreditation and for certification, and a great deal of change in the industry itself. So just moving to, there we are. So we are increasingly eating foods sourced globally. Markets are open, I suppose. No longer do we have the seasonal markets that we used to have because of the ability to source produce globally from other countries. So the impact of foodborne illnesses is affecting almost 1 in 10 people in the world and causing 420,000 deaths annually. In Australia, we're fortunate enough to have a very safe and secure food supply, but each year there is an estimated 4.1 million cases of foodborne illness that result in 31,920 hospitalisations, 86 deaths, and 1 million visits to doctors on average. So as you can see, there's a great cost to the economy of these sorts of foodborne illnesses. Recent consumer research in Australia has highlighted some areas for improvement. 1/3 of all households have at least one vulnerable person at risk of severe illness if they get food poisoning. So vulnerable people could be pregnant women, could be elderly, or people with reduced immunity. 70% of people don't know the safe cooking temperatures for foods such as poultry and egg dishes that may be contaminated with Salmonella and Campylobacter. And 1 in 4 adults are taking a food safety risk by eating raw or undercooked egg dishes, especially as 12% of them eat these foods at least monthly. So that's some really worrying results from that market survey here in Australia. And as I said, we have what we consider to be a very well-developed industry that is very food safety conscious. But of course, food safety is everyone's business. So it's not just the producers, it's not the manufacturers, but it's also those people that are preparing foods in the home and or could be transporting food or providing catering. So it's everyone's business. Just looking very quickly at some food trade figures. So the total food trade figures in 2016 was $618 billion US dollars worth of trade. You know, coming from Australia, our exports are roughly around 10.6 billion, with those representing 13% of the total value of Australia's goods and services exports. And in New Zealand, there's actually a slightly larger percentage of the total value of New Zealand's goods at 63%, even though there's $2.6 billion worth of trade. So you can see that there's you know, a lot of food trade globally, and that represents risks because of the amount or the number of times that food is transacted or changes hands. So each time food is traded, there's risks to the food safety of that food. Now, until 2005, there was no internationally recognised certification standard for food safety management systems. Until then, we relied on the hazard analysis critical control point system and guidelines that were produced by Codex Alimentarius as an annex to the general principles of food hygiene. That was the general standard that was used by many certification bodies, food businesses, for ensuring that they had control of the food safety hazards within their organisations. Some countries actually adopted these principles as national standards. But back in 2005, ISO first published ISO 22000, incorporating those hazard principles within a management system structure. That standard was last revised in 2018, aligning it with the high-level structure that many management system standards adhere to. And that allows for food safety management systems to be integrated with other types of management systems that an organisation may have in place, such as quality management systems or environmental management systems. It was also revised to include some current food safety issues, such as food fraud and food security. And at the same time, there were issues around the use of some terminology which was addressed at the same time, particularly around operational PRPs. With the last, in their last ISO survey, it was identified that there were 32,000 certificates covering 36,000 sites. That's ISO 22000 certificates, making it one of the largest food safety schemes globally. To support the certification against that standard, there's also ISO TS 22003, which is currently under revision. And these are the requirements for the conformity assessment bodies offering certification to ISO 22000. Now, as well as 22000, of course, there are several different food safety management system schemes or product certification schemes internationally. And I'm sure that a number of you have heard of schemes such as FSSC 22000 or BRC or IFS. So they're just a small number of the schemes that are available. Because of the fact that ISO 22000 wasn't developed until 2005, there were actually a large number of schemes that had been developed. Some were for a regional application, some national applications, each slightly different in their approach to issues such as regulatory compliance, national hygiene standards, and other national issues. So, what is accreditation? So we talked in the last slide about ISO TS 22003, which is used for certification bodies. Well, that's the standard that accreditation bodies use to accredit those conformity assessment bodies. So a typical definition from the International Accreditation Forum: accreditation assures businesses and end users that the conformity assessment body providing certification to a standard has the required competence and impartiality to do so, as evidenced by fulfilment of international standards and requirements. So you can see that the concentration there is on competence and impartiality. So accreditation bodies, through the use of the 17,000 series of standards, which are in the ISO CASCO toolbox, are really evaluating or assessing the competence and impartiality of a conformity assessment body to carry out the type of conformity assessment that they provide. Okay, this diagram really provides the hierarchy in the accredited certification process. So at the top we have accreditation. Often accreditation bodies have some sort of government recognition. As an example, the body that I work for, the Joint Accreditation System of Australia and New Zealand, has government recognition from both Australia and New Zealand. So we're recognised as being the accreditation body for both countries in the areas of certification, verification and validation and inspection. So accreditation bodies undergo peer evaluation, and we'll talk about that a little bit further in the next slide. And that's to ensure that we're all meeting the requirements of 17,011, which is the standard which accreditation bodies need to comply with. Accreditation bodies then accredit conformity assessment bodies, and conformity assessment bodies could provide testing and calibration of laboratories, certification activities such as certification of management systems, products, or certification of persons, inspection or validation and verification, or any independent evaluation. In turn, conformity assessment bodies will carry out conformity assessment of product and service providers. So it could be organisations like food manufacturers, food retailers, logistical companies, or or laboratories. Now, this hierarchy is intended to provide confidence and trust in the different levels of the hierarchy. And of course, we're looking to provide that confidence and trust to government, to consumers of the products or services, and the purchasers of the products and services. So we want to make sure that there's the trust in the certifications or the test reports or the inspection reports that are provided. Of course, there's a global network that supports this, these activities. So the International Accreditation Forum and the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation are the international networks of accreditation bodies. The IAF and ILAC have the objective of achieving equivalence and acceptance of results through multilateral agreements and arrangements between economies. So I talked a little bit about peer evaluations in the last slide, and that's an important piece to making sure that there can be this equivalence because there's a recognition that we're all working to the same standards and that we are meeting a level of confidence or providing a level of confidence because we are all meeting those requirements. So these organisations have a slogan of tested, inspected, certified once, accepted everywhere. So we're, by that we're saying that if a test report is provided by an accredited lab in one country, it should be able to be accepted by another economy. Similarly, if we have an ISO 22000 certificate issued by an accredited certification body in one country, it can be accepted by an organisation in another country. So we've got that, that level of confidence that there's equivalence of outcome, particularly where you've got the same certification standard being used and the same accreditation standards being used. And that's certainly the case in food safety with ISO 22000 certification, where we've got ISO 22000 as the certification standard and ISO TS 22003 as the accreditation and 17021 Part 1 as the accreditation standards. So signatories to the MLAs and MRAs must meet the requirements of ISO IEC 17011. And you'll find in both IAF and ILAC there are other requirements as well which are added to that document. It may be scheme specific. In the case of IAF, we have some scheme specific requirements for ISO 22000 as far as the accreditation body requirements are concerned. So we have added additional requirements around how the accreditation body actually awards their accreditations. Also, government and regulators rely on the MLAs and MRAs to further develop or enhance trade agreements. Now, it's often recognised that these MLAs and MRAs, while they form the basis of these trade agreements or some of these trade agreements, there may also be additional requirements that governments may include in these agreements to ensure that their specific requirements are met. Now, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about food supply chains and how some of these standards that accreditation bodies use actually fit in to the food supply chains. Now, these graphics are taken from the World Accreditation Day brochures that have been supplied by IF, and they're a good representation of where these standards can be used. So for instance, for crop and animal production, there are a number of different schemes that rely heavily on product certification, and they would include schemes like Global Gap, which is probably the most well-known on-farm assurance scheme internationally. But there's also other schemes like Canada Gap that also utilise this standard. So within these on-farm schemes, they have a component of inspection, or they can have a component of inspection. They can also have a component of management system. And Sean mentioned that before about how some of the schemes that we operate with actually have components of both management system and product. So to ensure that the product itself meets certain specifications, it may be MRLs, or it may be other product specifications, or it may be a process certification. So it can be a mixture. We have a number of different hybrid schemes. But as well as that, of course, you have testing. So we have test laboratories that are looking at chemical and microbiological testing of these sorts of products. And so that's another important component in that part of the food supply chain. We also have transportation. So traditionally, there's been a lot of inspection of transport vehicles, of transport, bulk shipping containers, all of those sorts of transport vehicles. And also, though, there are some small schemes that have a management system component, looking at how the products are actually transported to make sure that they are kept, that the products are kept to certain temperatures during that transportation process. Processing and packaging. As I mentioned before, there are a number of management system and product certification schemes for processing and packing facilities. And as well as that, many have accredited laboratories that carry out certain testing throughout the manufacture of food products. If we move on to retail, again, there could be a mixture of different types of schemes. Certainly in New Zealand, for example, they require an inspection of a food safety plan for retailers, and then there's also requirements around the testing of products in doing market surveillance. And then catering is another example where we have either inspection, and that inspection could be carried out by environmental health officers, or we could have management system certification of catering or food service operations. So as you can see, throughout that food supply chain, there can be a number of different types of conformity assessment. And with the publishing of 17029 for verification and validation, that actually offers us a new, well, not a new type of conformity assessment, but it, I suppose, offers opportunities for various food claims to be verified or validated, depending on the claim itself, whether it's looking at how the actual claim can be verified or validated moving forward. So it offers us other opportunities as well. I mentioned before that ISO 22000 was revised in 2018, and it was revised to include some emerging food safety issues. So I just wanted to quickly go through some of these emerging food safety issues and how we need to be mindful of these moving forward. So food fraud, it's a collective term used to encompass the deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation of food, food ingredients, or food packaging, or false or misleading statements made about a product for economic gain. A mouthful, I know, but we see this emerging. Not too long ago, we saw some substitution, meat substitution, where some horse meat was substituted. And we will see more of this moving forward. I've included here a really interesting resource that, that we can look at, and that's the European Commission has a knowledge centre for food fraud and quality, which publishes a monthly summary of cases. And as we can see there on that particular one that I've included on that slide, an example there is Italian authorities seized 20,000 eggs marked with labels that did not reflect their origin and way of production. The eggs were bought from a farmer, raising hens in cages and resold as free-range eggs. So that's just an example of the type of food fraud that we may be dealing with, as well as things like the substitution of horse meat. So just some examples. That's a very interesting site with a number of these. Well, it's a monthly report, and so they've got about 2 or 3 years worth of reports on the types of food fraud that we're seeing in the marketplace. Food safety culture in a business is how everyone thinks and acts in their daily job to make sure that the food they make or serve is safe. So I'm sure that everyone has experienced from time to time organisations that they just do enough to comply. They just do enough to get by, just do enough to meet the regulation. So food safety culture is about doing more than that. It's actually about having pride in the food that they're producing. And it's really looking at things like their brand, their reputation, and not just from having to comply. So this is really emerging as a really important piece as far as food safety is concerned. The better the food safety culture in businesses, the more likely we are to reduce the foodborne illness situation. We also have food security. So food security means that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their food preferences and dietary needs for an active and healthy life. Now, of course, in the COVID-19 situation that we find ourselves in, not everyone has, or not every economy has a secure food source because of the closing of borders, etc. We're very lucky here in Australia in that we produce more than enough for our own personal needs. In fact, we export roughly 2/3 of what we produce. Other countries are not as lucky as us, and they rely far more heavily on imported foods. And of course, in times like these where we've got disrupted food supply chains, food security is a major issue, major issue. Just touching on regulatory frameworks and international standards. We're seeing more and more regulators actually utilising the standards that we use within our infrastructure and recognising third-party certifications. We've seen the FDA through the FSMA, or Food Safety Modernisation Act, has recognised conformity assessment bodies accredited to 17065 and to 17021 Part 1, so that's management systems and product certification bodies. An interesting insight, they are now going one step further. Now they're looking for far more smarter tools to actually look at how they can better predict when foodborne outbreaks may occur, looking for far more smarter tools for prevention of food safety outbreaks. Looking again, we see food safety culture appear as a major issue for them. And also looking at new business models, because our food businesses, and again, this has happened through COVID-19, you've seen restaurants that turn into fast food outlets. We've seen all sorts of changes around the delivery of foods to homes when people were isolated. And so there's all these new sort of business models, or a greater reliance on some business models that may, of course, have a bearing on food safety. So we'll all be looking forward to what the US FDA comes out with in their Smarter Food Safety, which should be released shortly. Some other regulators that use the international standards that we utilise. In New Zealand, the Ministry for Primary Industries has been using inspection bodies accredited by accreditation bodies in Australia and New Zealand for 20 years to support food imports and exports and domestic food safety. So that's been in place for quite some time, and JASANS has been involved in that for the full 20 years that this has been operating. Interestingly enough, they have been looking at remote techniques for verification work as well. And we'll be talking about remote audits in a moment. This next one, there's a European regulation that relies on accreditation to support food security in Europe. And it relies on accreditation of laboratories to 17025. Again, just another regulator using our infrastructure to support food safety. Now, I really would like to just reflect on what we've experienced through the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think some learnings from this. I think we've learnt, and this is accreditation bodies, certification bodies, our scheme owners, ISO CASCO. We've all learnt that we need to keep agile, flexible, and responsive. Now, I'd like to say that our infrastructure has always been agile, flexible, and responsive, but I have to be realistic and say that it can at times be bureaucratic. But I feel that in the COVID-19 pandemic, we've actually learnt some very valuable lessons And we have been seen to be all of those. So when I use the term agile, I mean it in the broadest terms, not in IT terminology or anything like that. But we really need to free ourselves from some of the bureaucracy that we have in order to be responsive. And I think that we've been able to achieve that. Keeping flexible. I know within our organisation, as an accreditation body, we had to move from on-site assessment to remote assessment in a matter of days. We didn't have weeks, we had days, and we managed to turn it around in 2 weeks. That's working within our current specific rules, but being flexible in the manner in which we provided our service. And we were able to turn that around. So we've learned that flexibility does not necessarily mean reduction in the standards, but finding other ways of meeting the same objectives. And we've been able to achieve that, and we can actually prove that. And a number of our certification bodies have done the same. Keeping responsive, that has to be the #1 learning, I believe, out of all of this. And for an organisation such as the IAF, they've managed to be very responsive by coming up with their frequently asked questions. And I've got the link there in the presentation to that. So we've been able to respond, and we've had other instances where we've been able to develop guidance documents for certification bodies and accreditation bodies in how to use remote assessment and audit techniques. And we've responded very quickly. So it's being responsive. I think they're the 3 key learnings. As far as remote assessments and remote audits are concerned, as I said, there's a number of our major certification bodies that have responded and are carrying out remote audits now. And that is happening with food safety as well. That can happen with ISO 22000 because of the rules that we've put around that particular standard. Not each and every food safety certification scheme has allowed these remote assessments, but certainly with ISO 22000, we're able to do that. And I think when we look at the principles by which we operate, you know, the remote audit still follows all of the standards requirements for what must be audited or assessed, and the proof of evidence and the issuance of non-conformities. So we're still looking for the evidence of compliance. We're still issuing non-conformities if we don't find compliance. We're just carrying out the audits or assessments in different ways. And I think we're actually proving that remote audit and assessment can be as effective as an on-site audit or assessment. But it all comes down to planning. And that's why I've got planning, planning, planning. Need to clearly define the audit objectives and select the appropriate technology to allow those objectives to be achieved. And you'll see that time and time again in all of the presentations that are on any of the accreditation body websites, on the certification body websites. It's clear that planning is the key to the remote audit or assessments being a success. And then there's so many technologies now that we're finding that we can use. It's not just all Zoom meetings, although a lot of the work can be done through a Zoom meeting, but there's the use of smartphones or tablets or videos so that you can actually walk around facilities. It's not just all about the review of the documentation. And of course, there's also wearable technology. And I still say that there's room for drones, but nobody's taking me up on my challenge. So that's really sort of the end of my presentation. I've just added a page here with a number of resources that you can have a look at. There's of course the ISO CASCO resource page. There's an ISO and food safety video. All of the World Accreditation Day resources. There's also a public sector assurance website that has examples of where regulators are using conformity assessment, and the business benefits website. And then, as I said, there's a number of different CAB sites that, that have tips for remote auditing. So thank you. And are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Kylie, for this very interesting presentation of yours. We got a lot of questions from the audience, and I will try to ask you the most relevant ones. I want to apologize one more time if we are not able to answer all the questions that we have received. We are really overwhelmed with the responses and with the interaction that we have received from the audience. Thank you very much to the audience at this point. We also received a lot of questions about the presentation and the recordings. And as already mentioned, the presentation, so the slides presented today and the recordings of this session will be made available to the audience after the webinar. So please bear with us. You will receive all the information in due course. Thank you very much, Kylie, one more time for your very interesting presentation. And while food safety is certainly a very important topic for many countries, developing countries as well, we have a question with regards to the countries that sometimes lack the adequate laboratory infrastructure to check against the requirements and the regulatory requirements for food and food safety. So what possibilities do these countries have to enhance their the food safety of the products in their country?
Yeah, that's a really difficult one because, you know, there are some economies that don't have the capability to test the products to the levels that are required by the importing countries. So there are options available. For example, sending samples to other countries. It's not often done because of the types of products that we're talking about. But looking at other markets, it's certainly markets that don't have such stringent requirements. That's certainly an option as well.
Thank you very much. Indeed, this is a challenge that UNIDO also encounters in many of its technical cooperation with the developing countries. And thank you, Kylie, for your insight on this. We heard a lot about remote audits, and especially in the current context of the global crisis, remote audits are becoming more and more important. So do you have any experience, or can you share any experience on remote audits of ISO 22000? And if yes, how can this be done in the companies? And a question that relates to that is, can an initial assessment against the standard also be done remotely, or would you recommend this only for future assessments or for second assessments?
Yeah, there's certainly certification bodies that are offering initial audits using remote technologies. So it is possible. It would probably be needed to be followed up at some time with an on-site audit, but I know that there are some bodies that are offering full initials via remote technologies. But as I said, they can use technologies such as the smartphones or video technology, all those sorts of things to actually see what the practices are within an organisation.
Thank you, Kylie. So while audits of private companies are already a challenge, what do you think is remote assessment for conformity assessment bodies an option? And can the remote audits ensure effectiveness of conformity assessment body management systems and related personnel? And what are the challenges here?
Yeah, I suppose, as I said in the presentation, it's really necessary to have a lot of planning in place to make sure that the objectives of the audit can be achieved. So the certification body needs to clearly identify the objectives and how they will achieve that by the use of those technologies. And then, of course, it's up to the accreditation body when we're undertaking our assessments to ensure that that planning has been effective and that an effective audit has been undertaken. So there's still checks and balances in place.
Thank you, Kylie. One other question that comes up with talking about remote audits. So as you said, we were forced in a couple of days to move from physical audits to remote audits and remote assessment. But do you think that this is something that will remain beyond the current health crisis? Or is this something that's only going to be used now for a defined period of time and we will move back to physical assessments later?
Yeah, these techniques have been around for quite some time. So the International Accreditation Forum has had a informative document on how to carry out remote audits and remote assessments for quite some years. And so many of the accreditation bodies and the certification bodies have used these techniques from time to time, usually to undertake audits or assessments of remote locations. So it wasn't a new technique, and I don't think that it will be put back on the shelf. I think that many of the certification bodies and accreditation bodies have found that it's such a useful tool and that there's many efficiencies in using those tools because we don't have the added cost of the travel, and that's cost as far as the travel itself, but also the opportunity cost, you know, of those resources being, of those resources travelling to an on-site audit. So there's many benefits to continuing on these sorts of remote assessments and audits.
Thank you, Kylie. Certainly, we're facing a lot of changes because of the current crisis, and we will have to get used to a new normal, like everybody calls it. So, most probably, remote audits and remote assessments will stay with us in this new normal. I have one more question because food safety is not only something that's bound to a certain standard or certain requirements, it is very much also a culture which is created and awareness which is created for safe food products. So despite the standards, which are certainly a very important tool to guarantee food safety, but what other practices or what other good practices are out there for countries to develop this safe food culture, particularly in times of a global pandemic?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think when it comes to these sorts of situations, these pandemics, I mean, we've not experienced that many, and we certainly don't want to experience many more. But when it comes to food safety, it's just really making sure that you're aware of where the food is actually coming from. I suppose in times of pandemics, it may be that, you know, our behaviours are changed, and so there's new sources of food because businesses have to change their business models. So it's all about awareness and making sure that people are aware of safe food practices, and that's in the home as well. So that education, the awareness of the consumer is really important in these sorts of situations.
Thank you very much, Kylie. Indeed, we also believe that raising awareness on food safety and on international standards is very important, and this is why we are here today, and we're discussing the topic of within this webinar. And we are unfortunately running out of the time. Although the topic is very interesting, we have to come to an end. At this point, I would like to thank all the attendees. We really had an overwhelming number of participants, and we received an overwhelming number of comments on the webinar. Thank you to you, Kylie. I can see from the feedback that the presentation was very well received and very interesting for the audience. We got a lot of questions on remote audits and remote assessments. And here I would like to refer to another event which we will have within the series of a joint UNIDO ISO webinars on countering the impacts of COVID-19 with international standards. The next event will be on 18th June on occupational health and safety, but the webinar thereafter on 25th of June will focus on remote audits and assessments of conformity assessment bodies. I'd like to make reference to that because we really got a lot of questions on this very interesting and rather new topic. So if you're interested to hear more about that, then please follow us in the upcoming webinars. More information on the webinars can be found on the respective websites, either on iso.org or on tii.unido.org. So don't forget to register for these upcoming events. And with that, I would like to thank you, Kylie, one more time for your very interesting presentation. I'd like to thank the audience for following us today and for posting all the questions. So thank you very much, everybody. And with that, I'd like to officially close the webinar. Thank you.